Everyone, hopefully you can hear me. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Kate Browning, ONN's Business Development and Strategic Partnerships Manager. If you're new to ONN, we are the provincial network for Ontario's 55,000 nonprofits and charities, and we work to help strengthen the nonprofit sector by engaging and advocating with and for nonprofits and charities and communities across the province. Before we dive into the webinar, just a few technical points. The webinar today will last about an hour. If you miss anything, not to worry, we'll be emailing all registrants the webinar recording and slide deck following today's webinar. And you can also download the slides from the handout section that you see in the bottom right corner of your screen throughout the webinar. So we've got lots of people joining today. So we've muted participant lines to reduce noise disruptions. And if you have questions that pop up throughout the webinar, we'll be hosting a full Q&A at the end of the session. So we'll be answering all questions together at that point. The ONN Nonprofit Insurance Program offers affordable, flexible coverage customized for nonprofit organizations of any size. This great program is available exclusively to ONN members, and we've partnered with the great Hub International on the program for their expertise and knowledge of our sector. So presenting with us today are two experts from Hub, Steve and Carolyn, and they'll speak to you more about commercial general liability insurance to protect your organization and personal insurance to protect your employees. So I'm now going to pass it over to our great Hub team to get the webinar started, and we will kick things off with a quick poll. Cool. So we're just curious to see if your organization currently has commercial general liability insurance. So feel free to just populate that and give us an answer so we can have an idea. Great, thank you so much. And I will now pass it on to Steve, who will give you a little bit more information about this coverage.
Great, thanks, Kate. Morning, everybody, or afternoon, I should say, everybody. So as Kate mentioned, my name's Steve Permiani, and I'm an account executive with Hub International, and I've been working with the nonprofit sector for over 10 years. Specifically, I've been working with the ONN and its wonderful members now for a couple of years. And last time we were here, we spoke a little bit about directors and officers insurance. So today, we're going to change gears a bit and talk a little bit about the commercial general liability policy and some of its key coverages, and then chat a little bit about who might need to consider purchasing the policy. So the presentation's really been designed as a basic overview. So keep in mind that it's always best to speak to a broker or refer to your actual policy if you do have one for the full extent of coverage. There is quite a bit of information to cover, but I'll try to keep things to a half hour. And then when I'm done, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague, Carolyn. And she'll be talking a little bit about personal home insurance, and the effects that changing weather patterns are having in that space. So we'll just kind of get right into it. All right, so the agenda looks a little like that. So we're going to just talk a little bit about, firstly, what a commercial general liability policy is. Then we'll sort of get into some of the key coverage features. More specifically, we'll talk a little bit about abuse liability, and then non-owned auto liability, special event liability. Then we'll review some of the common exclusions that are applicable to the majority of CGL policies. And then we'll look at some real-life general liability claims examples. So, what is commercial general liability insurance, or as it's commonly referred to, CGL insurance? So CGL insurance is a standard insurance policy issued to businesses and organizations to protect them from a wide range of negligent acts to third parties who allege claims for bodily injury and property damage. So important to note that those are really the two key key triggers: bodily injury and property damage. So these claims can arise out of your premises for things like slip and falls. They can arise out of your operations for things like fundraising or program activities. They can arise out of your products and completed operations. And of course, not every organization is going to need to claim under that section, especially those who aren't really producing any types of products. And claims can arise out of advertising and personal injury. So things such as libel and slander. The policy not only covers the organization itself, but it covers the directors, employees, and volunteers, all while acting within the scope of their duties. So it really is important just to ensure that volunteers are always included in the insured definitions. Not all GL policies are automatically always going to include volunteers. So if you do have a policy or are thinking of purchasing a policy, it's important to note that that really needs to be addressed. So just moving on. Should every nonprofit have a CGL policy? I mean, there's really two questions that you need to ask yourself. First, could the actions of the organization hurt anyone? And then second, could the actions of the organization damage anything? So if the answer is yes to either one of those two questions, then a CGL policy is something that needs to be considered and that you should have some dialogue about with your broker. In my eyes, really, there's very few, if any, nonprofits that don't actually need to have a CGL policy. Any organization that's providing any type of product, service, or advice should, really strongly consider a CGL policy as part of their overall risk management approach. So just getting into the policy a little bit itself, every policy has some form of an insuring agreement, which is really the portion of the policy where the insurance company promises to make a payment to or on behalf of the insured. The insured obviously being the organization or the individual that's named in the policy. So that does sound pretty broad, but it actually does sort of get narrowed down a little bit by the policy's exclusions and definitions. So the CGL's insuring agreement is to pay those sums that the insured is legally obligated to pay as compensatory damages because of bodily injury and property damage. And so compensatory damages are a sum of money awarded by a court to indemnify a person for their loss or injury. And again, so bodily injury and property damage, those are the two most important and common triggers for claims under a CGL policy. So there needs to be some sort of bodily injury or property damage to a third party caused by the organization's negligence. And then it must be proven in a court of law that they were legally liable for that negligence, of course. So the bodily injury or property damage must be caused by an occurrence that takes place within the coverage territory. And an occurrence is generally, it's defined as an accident that includes continuous or repeated exposure to the same general harmful conditions. Okay, so just we're going to look at some of the key features that we normally find in a standard general liability policy, or perhaps not all general liability policies, but these are certainly key features that you need to be made aware of, and there's certainly features and coverages that we ensure to include in all of the CGL policies that we place on behalf of our clients. So every policy is going to have a liability limit. Our program has up to $10 million, although 2 and 5 tend to be more common. But the liability limit is really the most that an insurance company will pay to an insured party during a specified period of time. Additional limits can be purchased if organizations require higher than 10 million, and we generally do that by way of what's called an umbrella liability policy, which would sit on top of the general liability policy if required. So moving on, so bodily injury and property damage, again, you're going to hear that a lot. Coverage A in a CGL policy covers the next two items, again, which is the BI and the PD, bodily injury property damage. And so they cover claims arising out of bodily injury or property damage to third parties. And these claims are often very ordinary type circumstances. So whether it's, you know, a slip and fall or a chair collapse or food poisoning at a fundraiser, perhaps, those are situations where you might see claims being alleged under the CGL policy. So bodily injury is physical injury, sickness, disease, or death of a third party. And again, so major reasons for those types of claims are going to include things that happen on your property, you know, off-site injuries that you might be responsible for during fundraising programs or other activities. The property damage is damage to tangible property that your organization, is legally liable for. You know, and that can be something as small as spilling a drink into, you know, somebody's laptop. So you know, if I could spill my water into the laptop right now and potentially could be sued for some type of property damage. I mean, the policy is going to have a deductible. So whether or not that's, you know, something that somebody's going to want to, you know, file a claim for is certainly questionable. The non-owned automobile liability, we're going to sort of review this in more detail. It is an important section of the policy, but essentially the coverage provides protection for the organization for claims arising out of employees or volunteers who use their own vehicles in the course of carrying out the organization's activities. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit more detail. Medical payments. So the policy can reimburse others without regard to the insured's legal liability for things like medical or funeral expenses. It's really intended to pay for the smaller sort of nuisance claims without the need for costly legal expenses. And there's usually a sublimit, mostly always going to be a sublimit on the coverage, and it's generally quite small, so nowhere near what the limit of the liability policy generally is. Contractual, so all CGL policies are going to contain a contractual liability exclusion, so it is important to make sure that broad form contractual liability is added back into the policy, just to cover all liability situations that might be assumed by the organization under contract. So employer's liability, this could cover liability from injuries to employees who might suffer from a workplace type accident in the absence of a workers' compensation policy or workers' compensation insurance. Then moving on to personal injury. So this will be found under coverage B. So coverage A, we spoke a little bit about bodily injury, property damage, and we will talk a little bit about more of that as well. But coverage B then would pick up any type of personal injury situation. And these types of claims generally don't involve any bodily injury or property damage. And really the only similarity is that they involve a lawsuit from a third party. So examples of these types of claims would be libel, slander, wrongful entry, violation of privacy, or being detained without consent. So, you know, while these types of claims aren't really as common as claims that we see under coverage A for the bodily injury, property damage, they can and do happen. So it's just important to sort of be aware that coverage is available for those types of situations. So physical and sexual abuse, again, we're going to sort of get a little bit more into the abuse coverage, but it is an important coverage that we're going to discuss in more detail. It essentially applies to organizations working with any type of vulnerable persons, so such as children, the elderly, or disabled individuals. The coverage itself is always excluded under a CGL policy, so it has to be underwritten separately so that it can be added back in by way of an endorsement. There are some insurance companies who actually issue standalone policies, so complete standalone policies, but the majority just add the coverage into the CGL policy again by way of an endorsement. And then tenants' legal liability. So this covers the organization when they're liable for damages to premises that they might rent, lease, or occupy. So if a landlord sues your organization for damages to his or her building, which you're legally liable for, then you could potentially make a claim under this section of the policy. So an example might be, leaving water running accidentally, and there's ensuing damage to the property, and as a result, your organization gets sued for that damage. It could also apply in situations where you've rented space at a trade show or a conference center, and you might accidentally damage the facility, which again you've been proven legally liable for. The section generally has a separate limit, and it can be quite low depending on the insurance company. So it is important to ensure that that your broker, is negotiating proper limits on your behalf of that coverage section. Okay, so moving on to the non-owned automobile liability section. So this covers liability for accidents caused by an employee or volunteer who are driving their own vehicle on a nonprofit's behalf. The coverage is designed to protect only the nonprofit organization and not the employee or volunteer. So they would have to be covered under their own personal insurance for their own injuries. Coverage applies above the liability limits of the vehicle owner's personal auto policy, and there's no coverage for damage to the vehicle that isn't owned by the nonprofit. Again, that would be covered under the employee's or volunteer's own insurance. So non-owned auto insurance is quite critical for nonprofits who have volunteers use their own cars for business-related purposes. Generally volunteers don't really need to let their broker know if they're using their vehicle occasionally for volunteer activities, as that's really not considered business use. But if they're using their car regularly for the organization's purposes, then it's definitely a good idea to have that conversation with them and just make sure that they speak to their personal insurance broker to make sure that they have the right coverage in place. So another section of this coverage is rental vehicles, which can be covered under non-owned auto, as well as physical damage to the rented vehicle itself, up to a specified limit, of course. It is important to make sure that that section is added. Technically, you can avoid buying coverage from the rental company if you decide to rent a car for business purposes. But what I always suggest to my clients, sort of as a risk transfer method, is if there is insurance available from the rental agency, it's generally really inexpensive, and it's always a better idea to purchase it and transfer that risk over to the rental agency so that any potential claims don't have an impact on your commercial program. So that's generally what I suggest, but the coverage is there and can be accessed for people who do rent vehicles on a regular basis, but again, for business-related purposes. Okay, so moving on to abuse liability. So this coverage is really paramount for organizations who are working with any type of vulnerable persons. And these types of claims, they're usually going to be pretty costly, and they really can stem from so many different forms. So the organization can be held responsible for the actions of their employees or volunteers, on the grounds that maybe they, have inadequate hiring protocols or just inadequate protocols overall. And there really is only a small number of insurance companies in Canada that actually offer the coverage. So it can be costly. It not necessarily is, but it can be costly because of the risks that are involved. But it also could end up saving your organization, a lot of money if the allegations are really ever made against you. So, what is abuse? Abuse is any act or threat of molestation, harassment, corporal punishment, or any other form of physical, sexual, or mental abuse. Who does it protect? It protects, persons including but not limited to children under the age of consent, handicapped persons, or again, the elderly. So why does abuse occur? So incidents of abuse exist when individuals are in a position of power. Past incidents, they do develop into claims when victims reach adulthood and then are unable to lead a normal life. There is increased awareness of abuse, and that can lead to more reported incidents, which is really what we're seeing more and more of these days. Our society tends to be sort of going in that direction. So as people become more aware, incidents of abuse are being reported more often. Abuse certainly isn't a new topic, but it is the number one concern now for organizations who are working with any type of vulnerable person. So it's always something that we have to kind of discuss and make sure that if there is if you are working directly or indirectly, that it is properly addressed. So the impact of an allegation of abuse can be pretty significant. So there could be emotional trauma to the victim, emotional trauma to the victim's family, enormous legal liability to the organization, and of course the damage to the reputation of the organization. So these are all pretty big reasons to make sure that you've got the right coverage in place. It is important to note, though, that abuse prevention and adequate protocols are a must. So for any insurance company to even consider offering the coverage, there needs to be ongoing screening, training on a regular basis, and supervising really needs to be in place and also enforced. So things like abuse reporting and record keeping and facility safeguards are all things that an insurance company is going to look for before being able to offer the coverage to anybody. Okay, so moving on to special event insurance. So there's a lot of CGL policies that are going to exclude special events or include parameters surrounding what is and what isn't covered. So it is important to, again, make sure that your policy does have the right coverage if you're engaged in this sector. I mean, events are a common occurrence. So it is important to have that dialogue, with your broker, just to make sure that your policy does address special events, or if need be, separate policies are issued and put in place for these special events. Generally speaking, with our program, if the event is less than 5 days, and no alcohol is being served and attendees are anywhere between 1 and 300, then coverage is automatic and we don't really need to do anything or even put the insurance company on notice. But events where alcohol might be being served, such as banquets or boat cruises, golf tournaments or concerts, they might need a separate policy. So it's always important to just make sure that when you are organizing these events, that you sort of maintain that dialogue with your broker. But events where you have a booth or a kiosk or other similar type of events where you're not really acting as the host or organizer, those are generally going to be automatically included in your policy. We tend to sort of define events as revenue generating. Where a large number of attendees are invited. General meetings wouldn't really constitute an event if they're part of the ongoing business activities. So some of the events where you might want to talk to your broker about can be religious assemblies, pageants, job fairs, concerts, charity auctions, award presentations, stage shows, and theatrical performances. And again, conferences and booths, to a lesser extent, of course, but depending on the situation. Okay, so every policy, like I mentioned sort of earlier, is going to have a set of exclusions. A policy is never going to really cover all types of risks, even though that term is really used quite often in our industry. And exclusions are provisions that either eliminate or narrow the scope of coverage provided by the insurance agreement, which we spoke to earlier. Insurance companies aren't really in the business of denying claims, but they do have exclusions built into policies, which really serve various purposes. Most exclusions apply to risks that fall into various types of categories. Such as catastrophic type of situations. So examples would be war or terrorism. things that might be covered elsewhere are generally excluded. So, commercial auto, watercraft, or aircraft liability, there's more specific policies that are put in place to address those types of risks. And then also things that are illegal, not accidental, or easy to control are other categories where you might see exclusions fall under. So, insurance policies are really designed to cover fortuitous events. So they pretty much exclude any type of intentional loss. Intentional injury or property damage, employment-related injury, insured versus insured. There is an exclusion that prevents, one insured from being able to sue another insured. However, that can be easily removed with a cross liability clause, which we generally add into our policies. The majority of cases of pollution liability would be excluded, again, because that would be something that would be covered underneath a more specific policy. And the auto, watercraft, and aircraft we mentioned. And then bodily injury or property damage resulting from the organization serving liquor. And again, this is if you have a third party coming in to host an event and they're serving the liquor, it's a bit of a lesser concern, but it is something that generally insurance companies are very cognizant about and very concerned about with respect to ensuring that people are doing that responsibly. Okay, so moving on. So these are some claims examples, and I'm not really going to read them word for word, but I just I wanted to include them. There's 4 claims examples that I wanted to just add in here, just so you can sort of get a sense of how the policy can be triggered. So feel free, and I do encourage you just take a read of these examples when you have a few minutes, just to kind of get a sense of how the policy might respond in certain situations. There's again 4 there, so I won't get into them, but that's really it for the commercial general liability portion. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Caroline, and she'll get into the personal home section. Thank you.
So just before we get started on that, we're going to pop up another quick poll to introduce this next section. Great. So it looks like the majority of people are going with water. So
right.
Smart audience members here. Passing on to you, Carolyn.
All right, thank you. Welcome. My name is Carolyn, and I'm the marketing specialist at Hub. I'm here on behalf of the Home and Auto, and I will be talking today about the spring season and the changing weather patterns and the impact that it's having on insurance. So the weather patterns are changing worldwide, and it's a trend that's affecting Canada directly. So severe weather damage claims paid by Canadian insurance companies has increased more than 13-fold over the past 30 years. Also, Canada has become wetter since the 1950s, with an increase in annual precipitation of 16%. Major floods represent almost 40% of all natural disasters ever recorded in this country. So in today's world of extreme weather events, $1 billion has become the new normal for yearly catastrophic insurance losses. Most of this is due to water-related damage. So with the weather that's changing, insurance is also changing. Before, fire used to be the main cause for property insurance claims. Water damage claims were very rare. Now we're seeing 90% of people will have a water damage related insurance claim in their lifetime, and only 10% will have a fire related claim. So with the spring coming up, after a tough winter, spring is always a welcome change, but with the warmer weather comes a new series of challenges. Preparation ahead of severe weather and risks associated with warmer temperatures should start as soon as possible. And now with the warmer weather that we've been having the last few days, this is a great time to start thinking about those precautions. So we have 10 tips here of reducing the risk of water damage to your property. The first one is to keep your road drains clear of any obstructions. So again, over the winter, snow and ice buildup. You always want to make sure that any drains near your home are properly cleared. Cleaning your eaves troughs and downspouts so that water is directed away from your home. Again, this is very important because you wouldn't want any water pooling near your home. Also, if you're planning on being away, a lot of people like to go away this time of year, you should always arrange to have someone to check on your property. It's always a good practice because the worst thing you would have is coming home after a lovely vacation to any flood damage or water damage or any kind of thing around your property. Also, you want to ensure the proper grading around your home. It's always important to install a sub pump to make sure, and to also make sure that the one that you do have is working properly. So again, spring's a great time to make sure you check the maintenance on them. It's also important to install a backwater valve or a plug-in to plug into drains, toilets, and other sewer connects. All right, and then what also is important is to elevate your furnace or hot water electrical panel if they are in the basement, or to relocate them to a higher level. And it's always important to store any important documents or irreplaceable personal objects away from where they can't be damaged. So a lot of people are now finishing their basements. They're putting in wonderful entertainment centers down there, spending lots of money. So it's always important, make sure that whatever you do have down there, you're keeping your receipts and things like that in the event that you do have to make a claim. And also, if you do live in a flood-prone area, recommendation is always possibly not to have your basement finished in those areas. And also, again, like I mentioned, you just want to keep very expensive items out of your basement. So water is happening, and with the emergence of flooding and large storms in Ontario, weather-related claims have increased significantly in the past 10 years. Just last week in Brantford, they declared a state of emergency with the Grand River flooding. So a lot of people were impacted, unfortunately, by the flooding there. Water damage claims are the most frequent claims that insurance companies deal with, and it's important to make sure that you're prepared with the proper water coverage. So the types of water coverage that you might be familiar with hearing is overland water and sewer backup. Overland water coverage is for water damage caused by the overflow of a lake or river, heavy rain, or rapid snowmelt that enters your home from a point at or above ground level. Sewer backup is coverage if sudden and accidental water backs up and flows into your home from the municipal sewer system, private septic system, or through sub pump failure. So we have some frequently asked questions. The first, what's the difference between overland water and a flood? So overland water is fresh water from rivers and lakes, or water suddenly accumulating from heavy rainfall or spring thaw. Flood refers to coastal flooding from salt water, such as from tsunamis and tidal waves. The introduction of overland water endorsements means that freshwater flooding is now an insurable option. Overland water coverage for water damage resulting from excess rainfall and rising river waters. The next frequently asked question is, can I buy overland water protection without sewer backup coverage? And the answer is no, because sewer backup coverage must be in place when you buy overland water protection, as the two are designed to work together. You can buy sewer backup coverage alone, but you must remember that there is no sewer backup coverage if overland water has entered your home. So this is just a really important feature to find out. what you do have on your policy. And if you are uncertain, the best bet is to call your insurance broker or your insurance provider to find out what you are covered for right now, and to find out if you do have the proper limits even on your sewer backup coverage. And also we highly recommend overland water coverage as well. So again, protect what you love. You want to protect your property and all your belongings. What's really great are flood alarms. You can install these in an area where water leakage is a concern, so near your washing machines, dishwashers, showers, bathtubs, water tanks, and sub pumps. And what's great now, you can purchase these through like Home Depot, Lowe's, many places. They even have a lot that are smart enabled, so you can access that on your smartphones. So again, just always you want to make sure that you're taking all the proper precautions to ensure that you're protecting your home. A sewer backup valve you want to install on your sewer line, and it's designed to allow water or sewage to flow only one way, which is out of your house. So wind damage, again with spring, that's another concern. So damages to homes caused by hail or wind is usually covered, and it includes losses caused by flying debris or falling branches or trees. And again, if you were to ever run into any wind damage, your best bet, if you're insured with us with Hub, we do offer the claims counseling. So you can call us to see if your best option is to make a claim or not. So sometimes people have never made an insurance claim. They're not sure what to do in that case. So again, when you're with a broker, what's great with a broker is you do have claims counseling. So if you were to call Hub, here are a few things that could help start the claims process. You would want a list of all your damaged or destroyed items, if possible, your proofs of purchase, photos, receipts, and warranties. So it's always good to actually keep a home inventory, and we say, you know, spring's a great time to start one of those. You can find a lot of resources online of how to start your own home inventory. It's a great thing to have in the unfortunate event that you would have to make a claim one day. So take photos of damage that's incurred around your home, and keep the damaged items unless they were to pose a health hazard. You want to keep all receipts related to the cleanup and living expenses if you've been displaced, if you've had to move out of your house. And you want to ask your insurance rep about what expenses you may be entitled to and for what period of time, because that coverage can vary depending on the company that you're with. So with, as a member of the ONN, Hub is the exclusive partner on the group home and auto program. So what that means is you get preferred discounts on your home and auto insurance. So that's a 15% discount on your auto and 10% on your home. You'd also be eligible for other discounts if you're conviction free. If you have a home and an auto, you could get a multi-line discount. If you have your driver's training certificate, that'd be for your auto policy, and if you're claims free. At Hub, we insure pretty much everything. So for cars, trucks, snowmobiles, ATVs, campers, motorhomes, houses, condos. If you're a renter, we have renter's insurance and cottage insurance as well. The benefits are flexible payment plans. There are no service fees, and this program also extends to your spouse and your dependents. And we do have a dedicated sales and service team for this program. With Hub, you have the experience of highly skilled sales and service representatives. And again, we do offer the claims counseling, which is unique that you couldn't get if you were insured with someone, say like Bel Air, Direct, any of the banks and things like that, with any direct writers. So again, you need to make a claim. We'll counsel you through that, tell you your options and whether you should or you shouldn't. We're multilingual. We've got a number of different speaking sales and service reps. We are paperless, so we can do all of your applications completely over the phone and through email. And there are lots of options as we do work with numerous insurance companies. So if you are interested in getting a quote, you can call us at our 1-800 number, at 1-855-582-3022, or you can visit us online for a quote at onn.hubquote.ca. Thank you.
Great. And we will just open up the floor now to any questions that have popped up. Feel free to submit any questions right now. And while we still have Steve and Carolyn on the line, we can for sure answer any questions that you have. Don't see any.
Wait for time. We're really good for time.
Mm-hmm.
I guess everybody's hungry.
Oh, here we have one from Mara. Mara is asking, can you talk a little bit more about employment-related injury?
Yeah, so I mean, employment-related injury. There is what's in Ontario, employees are covered underneath work comp insurance. But if there were employees that weren't covered under work comp insurance and there were employment-related injuries, there is what is called again the employer's liability. So the policy can pay for work-related injuries. Again, and that's in the absence of a work comp policy. Or there also is contingent employer's liability, where the policy might pay contingent type losses to employees that are working with an organization. But I mean, again, it really depends on the circumstance and situation. I mean, if there is employees that are covered under work comp, then that would be where employees would first make a claim for any work related type of injuries. So there is an element of coverage there, and again, it just sort of really depends on what the circumstances and situation are.
Okay, question from Stephanie. So what do you need to look out for regarding directors and officers insurance?
This presentation was really designed around commercial general liability insurance, but so things that you need to look out for in terms of underwriting criteria, if that's what you're asking, I'm not necessarily sure. But I mean, generally insurance companies are going to look for, the financials of an organization, how many directors and officers there might be. Those are sort of, what type of assets and liabilities the organization has. That's the information that we need to capture before we can go to an insurance company and then sort of have them quote on the organization's behalf. I'm not sure if that's the question that you were asking. So if not, please feel free and maybe to ask and a bit more specifically, and I'll be glad to help you out.
So it looks like there are a few questions about directors and officers insurance. So we'll definitely send out in the follow-up to this webinar Steve's contact information, so you can reach out to him directly and chat a little bit more. And if that's of interest, we can definitely host another webinar really focused on directors and officers insurance down the line.
So we actually, the last webinar that we did was focused exclusively on directors and officers insurance. So, I mean, I do have that that webinar still and that presentation available. So if anybody would like a copy, as Kate said, feel free to reach out and connect, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of that webinar and speak to you in person on the phone anytime.
So another follow-up question, I've heard employers opting out of WSIB, opting out of, WSIB and using other insurance. Is that a type of insurance that Hub offers?
No, so I mean, again, it really depends on the situation. If there are employees, office employees don't necessarily need to be covered underneath WSIB. So that is where the employer's liability section of the general liability policy would apply and would respond. WSIB is certainly mandatory for organizations who have general laborers who might be working in a shop, but certainly office employees aren't required to be covered by WSIB.
Does an organization need CGL if they don't have any property or staff, but have a board of directors and undertake fundraising and fund program activities?
Yeah, I mean, again, so you've really got to ask yourself. I mean, is there any anything that the organization is doing that can result in any type of injury to a third party, or is there anything that the organization is doing that could possibly cause some type of property damage to a third party, a third party's property? So I mean, again, this is from my perspective. I mean, I think that there's very few, like I said, if not any organizations that don't really need to have a CGL policy in place. I mean, so if you're holding, fundraising activities, if there could be, a chance for a potential injury at one of the activities, and that could be, it could be, there's so many different types of situations. And like I mentioned, they're usually, sort of, everyday ordinary type of incidents that would arise. So I mean, the answer to me would be yes. Now that being said, I mean, we certainly see organizations that that are, everything is very price, sensitive, and so cost is certainly a factor. So there are organizations that will consider one insurance and perhaps not the other. Some organizations might actually only buy the general liability insurance because they're contractually obligated to do so. So every organization is a little bit different, and and at the end of the day, I mean, I think everybody's appetite for risk is a little bit different. So what might keep one person up at night might not necessarily keep a person with a similar organization up at night. So I mean, everybody's slightly different, but we're certainly happy to have that dialogue and and come up with a customizable solution for your organization.
Fantastic. And another question from Tony. How long does the process take to settle a claim on average?
I mean, so it depends on the nature of the claim. I mean, liability, type situations are generally, they tend to sort of take a little bit of a longer. I mean, claims can, from the time a claim is reported to the time a claim is, an adjuster might be appointed on the claim. And again, it depends on the magnitude and size of the claim. Hub has our own in-house, claims advocates who work really closely with the insurance company as well as any outside adjusters, just to make sure that claims are always handled and managed, swiftly and fairly. It's really tough to say because it depends on the magnitude of a claim. First party property type claims generally, tend to be settled a little bit quicker. But from a liability perspective, it could take anywhere up from, months to years. So it's a little bit difficult to say.
Okay, great questions coming in. So thanks so much for your participation. We've got another one from Jolie. If our organization is participating in an event with volunteers offsite, what should we be prepared to have with us should anything happen? Are we legally obligated to have any documents with us?
You're not really necessarily legally obligated. Depending on if the event is being held at maybe some space that's perhaps being donated, or maybe perhaps an outdoor venue or a park, or in a public space, you might be required to furnish that party with what's called a certificate of insurance. And that's basically just going to provide evidence to that party that you, the organization, has sufficient and adequate insurance in place. And that would be something that you would, you'd get on the phone and you'd speak to us or, your broker about, and, you'd let us know what the particulars of the event are, and we would furnish you with a certificate of insurance so you could provide to the event space or the individual looking for that confirmation. So, employees, as far as employees and volunteers goes, I mean, if they're, going out and working on behalf of the organization, and they are, negligent in some aspect of, for causing any type of bodily injury or property damage to a third party, if the coverage isn't in place, then it's an unfortunate situation, but there'll be, no protection for the organization in those types of situations. So that's why I kind of say, it's from my perspective, there are really, really few organizations who don't really need the coverage. I mean, everybody should really, really consider that as part of their sort of overall approach to kind of managing the organization's risks.
Okay, and a question coming in from Michael. Do community foundations need CGL insurance? They fund activities by third parties but do not perform them directly.
It's a good question. I mean, and there is still a possibility that you might be named in the allegation. So, whether or not the allegation is meritless, or it just has it's not going to go anywhere in terms of the eyes of a court of law, you could still potentially be dragged in the suit. So one of the benefits of a CGL policy is that it's going to cover your defense costs. So nowadays, I mean, anybody can sue anybody for pretty much anything. So legal costs can get costly, depending on, again, the situation and the magnitude of the situation. But if you're named in a suit, you certainly want to have general liability insurance to at least pay for those defense costs. And maybe there won't be a judgment awarded. Maybe the allegation will be dismissed. But again, you still want to make sure that that any defense costs that might add up are also covered in the event that you're also named in an allegation.
Again, thanks for all the wonderful questions. So another one for Steve. Can you speak a bit more about contractual coverage under CGL?
Sure. So, I mean, so again, and so this can be, anything where, you might be entering into some sort of contractual obligation with, with a third party, and it could be anything from, entering into a lease agreement with your landlord. Those types of situations, any contractual liability. So every policy is going to exclude contractual liability. So it's just important that, your broker or, anybody that you're talking to. So at Hub, we automatically, every CGL policy that we issue has an override to that exclusion. So we're going to offer broad form contractual liability. So whenever you're getting into any type of contract, or if there's, a contract that's assumed between you and another third party, any liability type of situation would automatically be considered as part of the policy and something that would be covered. So I don't know if that answered your question, but again, feel free. I mean, I'm happy to take calls and provide more detailed information anytime if you need.
Just going to leave just one more minute for anyone to pop in any last minute questions, follow-up questions. We'll provide Steve and Carolyn's contact information again in the follow-up email, so you can easily get in touch with them and ask any questions that pop up after the webinar. So if there are no further questions, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Steve and Caroline, for this presentation. It's been super helpful and really wonderful engagement from everyone on the line today, so we really appreciate that. We hope that this webinar has given you useful information to find the coverage that's right for both your organization and your employees. As I mentioned, we'll be sending a follow-up email shortly with contact information as well as the webinar recording and slide deck. So exclusive access to the ONN insurance program is just one of the many great perks of being an ONN member. As we mentioned, this program is available to members only. Membership levels with ONN are tiered, very affordable, and they're based on your annual budget levels, and they start at just $100. So if you have any questions about membership or want to explore membership a little bit further, you can feel free to contact me directly at Kate, so Kate at theonn.ca. And just thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And thanks, Kate, for organizing such a wonderful webinar.